That's a grand fish, Sandy.
That's a nice
What about
fish.
a dram?
I don't mind if I hear a drum wee. Here's still the next in then.
Yes, Scotch whisky is the true product of Scotland, and it cannot be made anywhere else. If your steps should take you into the Speyside district of the Highlands, you will come across distillery after distillery in which the first stages of turning barley into whisky are performed. It's a fascinating story, so let's begin at the beginning. After harvesting, the barley comes to the distillery from the local farmer. In this shot there seems plenty of it, but there have been years in which barley has been scarce, and the effects of such scarcity are felt long, long afterwards. The barley is now steeped in water for about 60 hours. The action of water and of heat cause it to germinate, which is the outward and visible sign of the changing of starch into sugar inside the ear of barley. While the sprouting barley lies on the malting floor, it's constantly turned by men with wooden shovels. If you pick up a handful of barley from the loft before it's steeped, it looks like this under the magnifying glass. After being steeped in water, you can plainly see the germination or sprouting. The growth of the barley has to be stopped before it goes too far, so it's dried in a kiln. The kiln is easy to pick out in a distillery from the pagoda-like top, similar to the oast house in a hop garden. The furnace below the kiln is served with coke and peat. The aroma of the peat imparted to the barley during this drying stage eventually gives character to the whisky. Peat is the natural fuel of the Highlands, and you can't make the true Scotch malts without it. Cutting it is a man's job. They are setting it up for drying before stacking. Up in the kiln itself, men are turning over the drying malt amidst the aroma of the peat reek, as it's called. The floor being perforated allows the heat to rise through it. The next stage takes the malt to an enclosed mill in which it's crushed before passing into what is known as the mash tun. It pours in, looking rather like porridge, for water heated to 146 degrees Fahrenheit has been added. Rotating arms keep the mixture swirling. At the end of an hour or so, the sugar has been dissolved into a liquid which is now known as wurtz. The draff, or solid remnant of the ground barley, remains in the mash tun and is removed from it by a conveyor. This draff is valuable for feeding cattle. About 26% of the barley employed is recovered for this highly important purpose. The valuable sugary solution of the barley, the wurtz, passes through a cooling process and in due course goes to the next stage, that of fermentation. In this large tun room, not to be confused with the mash tun, are 8 vessels, some of them full, some of them awaiting their turn. In the empty vessel a man is dwarfed, and if left over long, he may join the spirits. The Duke of Clarence died that way in a butt, but he chose Malmsey wine. The full vessels contain the wurtz and an important addition, yeast. Look in the encyclopedia for a technical description of yeast. For our practical purposes, it's enough to state this, that yeast, part animal, part vegetable, is the agent of fermentation. It turns sugar into alcohol, and its methods are somewhat violent. The liquid bubbles up, A head is created which has to be controlled by a switcher or rotating arm so that it won't overflow. Now, the crux of the operations, distilling. And by this time the state, through its agent, the Customs and Excise, is taking a very full interest in proceedings. Distilling, of course, means the heating of liquid till it becomes vapor, then cooling it till it becomes liquid again. During the process, a separation of water from spirit takes place, which makes the last stage distinctly more powerful than the first. In the shape of the stills, resembling a giant pot, may reside the secret virtue of Scotch whisky. Why the bobbin? Well, the sound of its tap on the casing indicates to the still man that the wash, or fermented wort, is not rising too high and choking the neck of the still. Outside the building stand the worm cooling tubs, where the neck of the still is carried down in a spiral coil through cold water. This makes the vapor liquid again. Back inside the still house again to observe that whisky is distilled twice, and here it's passing through the spirit safe. A safe means a lock, and the revenue keeps the key to this one. But the distiller can do his testing and selecting without touching the spirit. On the left, the distillation of the first still, which is going to be distilled again. In the center, the fully distilled whisky. This is it, real whisky. On the right, the gauges for testing the strength. Hundreds of casks lying beside the distillery, waiting to be filled. For, as everybody knows, Scotch whisky has to mature, and the maturing takes place over a period of years. It's carefully selected and well-coopered casks. The cooper, to be sure, is a very important member of the distillery staff. The casks are filled in a special building, sometimes known as the spirit store, but here called a duty-free warehouse. The door is fastened by two locks, one controlled by the excise department, the other by the distillery management. From the spirit vat, which stands at the rear of the store, the casks are filled with the new whisky. Samples are taken from each cask. Strength is checked, and the amount of proof spirit is calculated by customs officer and distillery manager.
$60.51.2.
60.51.2, 11.2 overproof.
Then the quantities in each butt and hogshead are called out, with the excise officer checking the figures to make sure that all weights, identities, and other particulars are correct.
53 feet worth.
And presently, the casks are rolled down to the storage warehouses.